Hello everybody, welcome to Life and Life Only, and today I'm delighted to have with me via Zoom Patrick Humphries, who is the writer of many books, including Nick Drake, a biography, which was the first biography of Mr. Drake. So Patrick, how are you doing?
Very nice to see you.
Yeah, not quite in the flesh, but this is not bad, is it? We're on video, yeah. So obviously the main focus is going to be Nick Drake today, but I did want to talk about some other stuff. So could you just introduce yourself and tell us about some of the writing you've done that's not Nick Drake?
Yeah, I was a civil servant for many years, but I always enjoyed the weekly music press in the UK, and every week it was NME, Melody Maker, Sounds, Disc, Record Mirror. I never had confidence to submit anything, and then in 1976, NME famously advertised for hip young gunslingers, and I sent in a sample piece very much of the time, which was the NME writer was far more important than the person he was interviewing, which they liked, and they took me on as a freelance in 76, and then they took Tony Parsons and Julie Burchill on staff. I was regular freelance, and then in 1980, there was a staff vacancy at Melody Maker, which I took and was there for 2 years, and then freelance ever since. And my first book was actually 40 years ago this year, the first ever biography of Fairport Convention, which Hill Pie, Pete Townsend's company, published. And then that led to other books about Simon and Garfunkel, Tom Waits, Bruce Springsteen, Paul Simon, Dylan, the Beatles. But I think it was the Fairport connection that got me into, Ireland Records, Joe Boyd, Witch Season, Anthea Joseph. That then led, God, how many years, in the late 90s to my thinking about doing a book about Nick.
Well, we reckon it's 25 years since it was published, don't we? And then came out in 97. So what year did you start? How long was the process?
I was trying to think. The circumstances of writing it were very interesting. And I actually found I'd done a book on Paul Simon, which had done very well for Sidgwick and Jackson. And they were asking if I had any other ideas for any books. And Nick's name had come up when I did the authorised biography of Richard Thompson. And I was talking to my friend Peter Hogan, who was a literary agent. And I said, well, I keep hearing Nick Drake's name, but there's so little known about him. I mean, all really at that time, well into the 1990s, really all was known was the Arthur Lubo essay and the Fruit Tree box set and the Nick Kent piece, and I think there was a Zigzag piece. So anyway, I said to Peter, I think there might be a book in Nick Drake, but there's so little known about him. And Peter said, well, then write a short book. I thought, okay, it doesn't have to be a magnum opus. I pitched it to Sidgwick and Jackson, so I'm interested in doing a biography of a singer-songwriter, Nick Drake, who died in 1974. And I found the letter, I haven't got it with me, unfortunately, but I did find it, where Sidgwick and Jackson said, thank you, we have no interest in publishing a biography of Nick Cave at present. That's how well Nick Drake was. Nobody had heard of him. No, it's absolutely true. That was quite off-putting because I thought there was so little known. And so what I did, being sort of old-school journalist, this is all... It sounds obvious being in the mid-90s. This was pre-internet, so you didn't sit at your desk and tap in Nick Drake and see what came up. So what I did was I put an advert in Record Collector, the monthly UK magazine, saying anyone with any memories of Nick Drake, please contact Patrick Humphries at my then address for a possible biography. And somebody in the Marlburian, the school magazine, the Marlborough, anyone with any memories of N.R. Drake, 1962 to 1966, please contact. Yeah. And I got a load of responses, and most of them were from old Marlburians. And I thought, well, that's probably the good place to start at school. But I was quite nervous because, you have to remember, this is going back to a time when the image of Nick Drake was this doomed, haunted, solitary, gloomy figure. And the very first interview I did was with Jeremy Mason, who was Nick's school friend at Marlborough, but also famously it was at his parents' place in Aix in France where Nick stayed.
And he was featured in 3 hours. So he was in 3 hours.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. As Jeremy said, he's up there with Peggy Sue. He's one of the, he's been mentioned in a song by Nick. Jeremy lived in Wandsworth, which was just round the South Circular from me, and where I was living in Brixton at the time. And I thought, well, let's go and see Jeremy and see just what he might tell me about Nick. And I went there, and Jeremy was a very, very convivial figure. And And I was very respectful, and this image of Nick, who never smiled, and never listened to Leonard Cohen records. And, I said, what were your memories of Nick at Marlborough? And I said, we had a great time. We used to go, I remember we went to see a Bon Art exhibition on the South Bank and then got pissed and went to see Inez and Charlie Fox at the Marquee Club. And I thought, oh, wow, suddenly Nick became alive. And then talking to people at Marlborough, and then his old housemaster, Dennis Silk, everyone was very cooperative. And, of course, I knew Gabrielle because my uncle was the doctor for the British colony in Burma. And before he died, we'd been in brief communication. Unfortunately, I never got to talk to him about Nick. But Gabrielle remembered my Uncle Jim, James Wallace Lusk. She remembered him very fondly, which allowed me to interview her briefly about the early years. So anyway, I started doing all these interviews, and gradually, a picture began to emerge, a more rounded picture.
Yeah. Just for any of the audience who don't know Nick too well, basically he was recording from 69 or 68, let's say, started, but his first album was 69, made 3 albums, died in 1974 at the age of 26, and basically faded into obscurity. And then just gradually the interest came. And the one I remember is reading at some point that The Cure said that their name came from a troubled cure for a troubled mind.
Oh,
which is
really?
a lyric. Yeah,
I never knew.
Yeah, I didn't buy that completely when I first heard it.
I'll
take him at his word, And then there was the band who did Life in a Northern Town, whose name is escaping me.
Dream Academy. Yes.
Dream Academy, that's it. So what I wanted to ask you was, where did your book sit chronologically in terms of the Nick Drake revival? Were you right in the middle of it?
Well, I think in all modesty, I actually began it. I mean,
right.
You're right, there were odd mentions. But if you look at what there was about Nick Drake prior to my book coming out in 1997, you would struggle to fill a small magazine. I mean, there was very, very little. When my book came out, I mean, it got him on the cover of Mojo magazine. It was very widely and well reviewed. And I think part of the thing was that, it was old, Fleet Street, foot in the door, tracking people down, and I'd interviewed Jeremy about Marlborough, and then he would say, well, have you spoken to our so-and-so? And you track our so-and-so down. And he thought, you must speak to our so-and-so. And gradually you get to all these people.
Yeah.
And, they each tell you a little more about this, enigmatic character.
Sure.
And gradually you begin to get a fuller picture. And I think, in answer to your question, I remember tracking Robert Kirby down, who, of course, was Nick's great friend and string arranger.
Yeah.
And he was, I think, a market researcher in Hendon or somewhere. And, God knows I found him. And he said, he was delighted to sit and talk because he said everyone thought he was dead because Nick was dead. Everyone thought he was dead. And he was a wonderful, his Paul Staff, a wonderful character. And, of course, when my book came out, it led to him getting a lot more work from, he did string arrangers for Paul Weller and a lot of modern groups whose name I've completely forgotten. But it almost gave him a second career. And I think it actually did revive interest in Nick to the extent that people realised that it was an extraordinary talent that had been snuffed out too early. But there was a life behind that tragic early death.
Yeah. Tell you one strange thing. YouTube brings up all kinds of strange, random things. And I was searching on Nick Drake, as I often do, and it came up Gabrielle Drake's appearance on This Is Your Life from 1987. I don't know if you've ever seen that. And I started watching a little bit, and I was thinking, I wonder if Nick will get mentioned. And then, of course, they brought on the parents. They said, here are your parents, Molly and Rodney. And suddenly there's Molly Drake, and because I like her music as well, and Rodney Drake. And then they suddenly said, oh, you also had a brother, Nick, who tragically died. And they flashed up a picture of Nick. And I was thinking, thinking in a parallel universe where he hadn't died, he might have been appearing on there. They might have said, well, absolutely, and here is your brother, Nick. And he would have come on with his famous stoop. It's so strange, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's very odd. I mean, then there was that other clip on YouTube, because there is no moving footage of him. That's one of the reasons, I think, why the enigma and the myth persists.
Absolutely,
if you want,
yes.
There's nothing that you can say. And then, of course, that clip turned up about, 10 years ago, of that figure at a pop festival.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Walking away from the camera. And it certainly looks like the back of Nick Drake. And if it isn't, it's, some of those first pictures of Robert Johnson appeared. If it isn't Robert Johnson, it damn well should be. And if that wasn't Nick Drake, that's probably what, the fact you couldn't see his face is perfect.
Well, I was going to say, someone in the comments rather cynically said, a tall, thin guy with long hair and a centre parting in the late 60s.
Yes, exactly. Yes,
Yeah, they're only kidding.
I think this is the thing. I think Nick was very much, I think one of the photos in the book or later was Nick reading the poems of William Blake, and I mean, who didn't in the 60s? He was very much part of that culture. And what I hope the book did was bring him alive in a sense, to give him a life. He's forever condemned as being this doomed, gloomy figure. And I mean, anybody dying at 26 is far too young. But I think, I genuinely think that for the bulk of his actually most of his life, he was quite a contented figure. And I think towards the end, nobody knows quite when the darkness descended, but I think he was delighted to get a record contract. And I remember, I was talking to, I think, Robert Kirby, and one of the few gigs he did, it was some apprentices' ball, and that they didn't pay any attention to his music, and everyone else had written, it destroyed him, and Robert said, no, I remember him coming to the flat, hooting with laughter. He had his 25 quid, and he was happy with that, And I think I found one of the quotes about Nick in a magazine, a quote about how much he hated public school. And in fact, that was the writer's opinion of public school. Nick actually quite enjoyed his time. There were so many myths that I had to sort of work my way through, to get something approximating the truth.
Yeah, for our overseas listeners, by the way, public school in England is basically private school, isn't it? Fee paying.
Yes, it's fee paying. You pay.
I think I did research why that was, but anyway, most people would probably think of public school as government school, but it's basically the opposite.
No, it's Eton and Harrow and Marlborough, which is one of the top, and you pay a lot of money. It's an upper class tradition, and that fragment of Nick speaking, it's what we call a posh voice. I mean,
I was just going to say, yeah.
He sounds quite, a minor member of the royal family. I mean, he was well brought up, he was well educated, and was very much a product of that upper middle class background.
Yeah, I only actually heard that fragment recently, I think, about a year ago. And it's quite revealing. I mean, he uses one a lot, doesn't he? One is rather drunk, or one is... He sounds like people said he was. He sounds like a slightly hesitant but reasonably cheery person. And I think what happens is when someone dies, I'm sure you'll recognise this, people always want to trace back and say, what were the warning signs? But, I mean, you know better than me, but from everything I've read about, and I've read your book, Trevor Dan's book, I haven't read Gabrielle's book, but read loads of other stuff. There doesn't seem to be anything in his childhood that would point to that, would you say?
No, I think it's interesting that, there were four of them. There was Rodney and Molly, his parents, and Gabrielle, his sister. And you see the pictures of them, and they're a very contented family. Gabrielle was that much older than Nick. I don't think she knew him that well. I think by the time he sort of got interesting, she'd left home and had her own career as an actress. His parents were baffled by his work and his music, and that culture, the counterculture that so much part of the late 60s that he was part of. I don't think there are any warning signs there. I mean, on the evidence of the work, I mean, Leonard Cohen shouldn't have made it past 30. It's a way that people read into these things. I think what's interesting about Nick and the posthumous legacy is that by all accounts, and I think it was Joe Boyd who gave me this figure, I mean, I said during his lifetime, his 3 records worldwide sold less than 9,000 copies. He sold more records the morning after the Volkswagen ad appeared than he did his entire lifetime. And I think it's very easy for people to sort of look for the first signs of that darkness encroaching and all that. But I think he was relatively happy. And I think the depression that came, my appreciation is that he did suffer from depression. Now, he was back home living with his parents at Tamworth in Arden, which is quintessentially Middle English village. It's got a pub, it's got a church, a village store. It's like a chocolate box cover. It couldn't be more Middle English. Yeah. And Rodney would have taken Nick to their local doctor and said, and he was given these antidepressants called triptazole. And, in the mid-1970s, GPs wouldn't have known anything about depression, I mean, if he'd been perhaps in London treated more sympathetically. And I often thought if he had lived, I mean, I think it was he didn't have an aversion to performing because, again, in my book, I pointed out at school he was a member of a number of bands. He enjoyed performing. Even his early solo shows he enjoyed. But such was the record industry at the time. And I remember talking to David Betteridge, who was Chris Blackwell's number 2 at Island, which was Nick's label for his lifetime. And he said we'd have these production meetings every week. And he said there were 2 questions on the agenda. And it's whether it was Roxy Music or Bob Marley or Fairport Convention or Nick Drake. Is there a single on the album and are they touring? And in Nick's lifetime, he never released a single. And he only ever played, I doubt if he played more than a couple of dozen solo shows.
Yeah.
So, his presence, his visibility in his lifetime was negligible, really.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I rambled on a bit, sorry.
No problem. So with this revival, so your book came out in 97. There's a wonderful documentary called A Skin Too Few, which
Yes.
would be a very good sort of Nick starter kit, because I'm sure there were some people who would be watching or listening that don't know him that well. There's another one called A Stranger Among Us, which has got lots of the sort of London set and the Cambridge set all in one room discussing him. Yeah. That one's a bit sort of, it's a less polished one. That Skin Too Few one is very sort of poetic, isn't it? Really
I think
beautiful.
any filmmaker's hampered by that lack of film footage, and there's only so many shots of autumnal trees in English landscapes.
There are a lot in that documentary, yeah.
No, it's great, but I mean, I think for a full appreciation, you'd need footage of, and some of it there may well be some. I think it's unlikely, but.
Well, I mean, we were discussing the Beatles. I mean, I have a podcast about John Lennon, and the Beatles has always been a big part of my life. And Beatles fans still believe that there may be stuff that may still come out of the woodwork, old stuff of them in Hamburg. I mean, I think the most miraculous recording of all is the one from the St. Peter's Fete, where John Lennon met Paul McCartney. I mean, the idea that someone recorded it. And in fact, I spoke to two of the Quarrymen. I was very lucky enough. And Rod Davis told me that the guy had actually recorded 12 songs. He recorded the whole evening and then, of course, wiped. Not his fault, but, he didn't know what was going to happen. But he wiped 10 of them.
No, I've heard the tape. I've heard 2 minutes. Well, 2 minutes of
it's
it.
2 minutes.
It is undeniably John Lennon. I mean, singing Lonnie Donegan songs is great.
Yeah.
I'm surprised he didn't make it onto Anthology 1. But you're right. I mean, I'm a huge Dylan fan. And I mean, even I'm, we're up to volumes. It's 16, the bootleg series. And there's stuff you didn't even know was rumoured and it has turned up. I think with Nick, it's the Peel sessions turned up for release. And I just don't think there's much out there. Toe the Line was the last song. I mean, I did say this, and I can't remember if it's to Joe or to John Wood when I was doing the book. I said, well, you've got these funky, great reel-to-reel tapes. Have you gone through both sides of them and listened? And they said, oh, yeah, we've done all that. But obviously they hadn't, because it was when they only flipped it over, and they found at the very end this lost song, Toe the Line. And when they found it, I mean, it made it on the BBC News, great lost Nick Drake song. It was... And I think, to my mind, as far as I know, there's nothing more in terms of film or music. But I often think when people who are around in the 60s or 70s, when they die, their children or their grandchildren will go through boxes and find tapes, labelled Cambridge 90s. I mean, who knows? Their parents, grandparents wouldn't necessarily have appreciated the value. And the children might not, but they will put something in Mojo or Record Collector and say, didn't there's any value in this? And people go, just a bit, unreleased, whatever. Well, we don't know.
Yeah. Well, there's an hour-and-a-half video on YouTube, which I just found recently. And I think a few of them may not have been heard, but then a lot of them are just fragments. And I think Gabrielle was a bit upset about this, because when this interest started in the 90s, fans would come and I think Rodney or Molly or both of them would give them bootleg tapes. And then, of course, years later, people would stick them on YouTube, and they're probably not the best quality.
They were delighted, they were proud of Nick, and that they appreciated just how ignored he'd been in his lifetime. Yeah. And they were so touched that people that come from America or whatever turn up on their doorstep and say, oh, Nick was great, I don't suppose you've got any. And they couldn't be happier that people would be sharing his music,
Yeah.
But you're right, they turned up. The one I heard was when he was in Aches. I'm not sure what happened. I mean, to be perfectly honest, the book came out 25 years ago. I was thinking of doing an update, and at the end of the day, I thought, well, actually, to my mind, what's happened is there's been all these other books, and there's been some insights and some things that I didn't get in my book. But to my mind, the one thing that would have made me want to do an update was Toe the Line, the unreleased Nick Drake song that came to light a few years ago. And, for an extra chapter just on one song, I didn't think it was worth it. But I did get to hear the Aches tape, which I think some of which ended up on one of the posthumous releases, and I can't remember which one. And that was 1967, one of Jeremy Mason's, I think, housemate, I think he was an old Etonian, had a tape recorder, which was, a very expensive luxury in 1967. And he recorded Nick in the kitchen of this farmhouse in France that Jeremy's parents had, which had a fantastic acoustic. And that's Nick doing some of his own songs and talking, and songs by Jackson C. Frank and Dylan. And I was a bit suspicious at first because I thought, well, why hasn't this come to light? But you realise actually, no, it is. It's pristine. And I think there's maybe a few tracks that never made it onto the posthumous release, which may turn. I don't know.
Yeah, there was one called what was that song that he used to gig but he never recorded it properly? Oh, was it Made to Love Magic? No. Yeah, no, sorry, it's Time of No Reply.
Yes.
And then there was Made to Love Magic, and they were kind of similar, but a few things turned up. You're right. Now, just going back to Jeremy Mason, I think in one of the other books I read, as I said, when we sort of retroactively look at things, we kind of say, was there a point? And did Jeremy Mason say anything to you about a change that might have come over Nick in X? And
well, I think the point he made to me was that he's pretty convinced it was this acid. He started taking LSD when they were either in France or when they went to... Again, my book, this has never ever been written about. The Nick Drake went to Morocco and is believed to have performed in front of Rolling Stones.
That's right,
Mick and Keith were in Morocco, and Nick, of course, he had long hair. The Moroccans thought he was a Rolling Stone. And this
of course.
He had, a lovely little vignette. Jeremy's convinced that it was a strong drug that Nick took that sort of tilted things around. But he said he said he noticed the last time he saw Nick was in 72, I think.
Yeah.
And he'd become this very introverted, monosyllabic figure.
Yeah.
And I think Jeremy always felt it was sort of the drug abuse that had done that. But that, I think, was speculation.
I mean, we do know, I hate to go into dark territory, but we do know that he was something to do with Alice Ormsby Gore, I believe, who was involved with Eric Clapton. I think there was heroin that went around that scene, but...
No, there was this big thing that when the book came out, people said how I got it all wrong, and that they knew the name of the guy who supplied heroin to Nick in Tamworth in Arden. And I thought, well, you've obviously never been to Tamworth in Arden because, it's so English. It's so quintessentially anybody vaguely hippie-ish or suspicious would have had their collar felt by the local bobby. I mean, the heroin deal, I personally don't think he did take heroin, but certainly there was, the one group I couldn't get into when I wrote my book was that sort of rather louche Chelsea set of the Ormsby Gores, which I think Trevor Dan did make contact with. I mean, there was this whole thing, I come up on this in my Beatles book actually, that the aristocracy was sort of slumming with the rock stars in the 60s and 70s. Very, very well-off people, and people that privileged thought it was great to go out with a guitarist or a singer. And there was that sort of link between the Chelsea set. And Nick was very part of that. How deeply involved he was, I don't know. I think he was quite shy. I think he was always on the periphery of things. I don't think that was the drug use. I think he was quite a shy person,
Sure. Well, there's an interesting story, I think Joe Boyd, I'm sure it was in your book, about this gangster guy, and they used to go and play liar's dice around his house. And what was almost ironic about that, if you think of Nick's social standing, Joe Boyd posited the idea that this East End gangster might have been the guy to bring him out of it somehow, because he's kind of slapped Nick on the back and say, come on, mate, maybe these upper middle class, maybe it's something to do with that culture that maybe you don't want to get so involved. I don't know. But,
I remember Linda Thompson, and bless her, she can't remember if she slept with Nick or not, Richard's ex-wife. She said, well, Nick, he never spoke. But then, we all thought, oh, wow, that's really cool.
That's it, yeah.
Depression stuff didn't register. Oh, wow. He just sat in the corner and didn't say, oh, wow. That was, I think, very much the thing.
Yeah. But obviously at some point they would have recognised it had gone a bit further, wouldn't they?
I suppose they would. But, the big thing that people made about Nick and at his funeral. There are all these different groups in his life, and it was only at their funeral they came together. Well, and that's true of most people. I mean, I've got friends who, we will sit and bend each other's ears about Bob Dylan until the cows come home. But, they don't know my friends who we have other interests or, school friends or whatever. I think we do compartmentalise our lives. And,
sure,
I think Nick was as much, he did that. I think there was this reticence to him. And, of course, we don't know really what he thought because, to my knowledge, he only ever did one interview with Jerry Gilbert from Sounds. Yeah. And I interviewed Jerry for my book, and he said, well, I wish I could have told you that the room was filled with his charisma when he came in, but, he shuffled in, he sat staring at the floor. The answers were sort of monosyllabic, yes or no, and, that was it.
Do you think maybe he did have stuff to say? Let's say he had found someone who he was very comfortable with. From what you know, I know it's hard to know, but do you think he would have had many insights, like, I don't know, politically or musically or...
Not more than anybody else who was, public school, university educated, on the fringes of the counterculture, read poetry, was aware of, was impressed by Dylan. I don't think there's any great lost Nick Drake interviews. I mean, I remember Jeremy Mason, who we mentioned earlier, who is mentioned in the song 3 Hours. Again, everyone thought that was the distance from Cambridge to London, Nick's university. In fact, it was the distance it took Jeremy and Nick took 3 hours to get from Marlborough to London. Minor point, right. I found out. And, he said one of the last times he saw Nick, and he said, well, why am I in there? What's it about? And then he sort of mumbled and muttered. He didn't have an answer, I think if he'd lived, he would have been happy to write songs, not have to perform them. They could have gone out from a music publisher to various different acts, whether it was Nana Muscuri or whoever it was, saying, here's a song you might be interested in. And he could have got quite a nice little income from that without having to go and perform and sell himself, which is something he obviously wasn't very good at.
Yeah, there was a very interesting, on one of those documentaries, I think it's called A Stranger Among Us. I'd like to get your opinion about this. There's a kind of not an argument, but a disagreement between Keith Morris, who's the photographer, and there's a fellow whose name I can't remember, who is an Island Records PR guy maybe, or I can't remember, and the Island Records guy is saying if Nick was around now, he'd be the sort of person who would have a big home recording setup and would be able to record. And Keith Morris said, no way, he's a poet, not a musician. And I thought that was an interesting, I don't know, which way do you go on that?
I don't actually buy the poet thing. I mean, one thing about writing a book about somebody who puts you off their music for years, you spend every waking moment listening for every nuance, for every guitar tuning, for every lyrical reference. And I literally didn't listen to Nick for years. And when I did go back to listen to him, I came away very impressed. I mean, after the book came out, I would get tape cassettes, EPs, CDs, the new Nick Drake, this is my, this sounds exactly like Drake. And there's hundreds of them. I go to ballets about Nick Drake and and tribute concerts and cover. And I thought, actually, the thing about Nick is he is quite unique. Even today, there's nobody sounds quite like him. It was that voice, that guitar, the lyrics, that combination that made it. I don't rate his lyrics that highly. Right. I know when I spoke to Keith Morris, at one point, I thought he died very early. He was talking about me doing captions to a book of his Nick Drake photos, so that never happened, unfortunately.
Right.
But he said it's extraordinary, all the work that he'd done, album covers for Led Zeppelin and Elvis Costello, and he said, Nick's the one that people wanted to talk to about. And he said it was, it was a day's work spread over. He did what? 2 photo sessions with him?
No, I think he did 3 actually. He did all 3, yeah.
Yeah, and it was, he said, in fact, it was in what, that was a day's work. It was 8 hours. But that's all people wanted to talk about. And I remember there was an exhibition of Keith's photos in Piccadilly years ago, and I went along, and there were these 2 young girls, beautiful young girls, when they can't have been more than teenagers, looking at these photos of Nick, and, and somebody told me he looks like a GQ model, and I think that's the thing. I think he died looking great, he had a fantastic look to him.
Oh, of course.
And I speculate that, his father was bald, and Jeremy, bless him, is bald, and if Nick Drake had lived, would he have become this, rather plump gentleman with receding hair, and would the intensity of the interest still continue? The fact he died in mysterious circumstances with only 3 albums to his name, you know. And at the end of the day, you're only talking about, there's barely more than a couple of dozen tracks that his reputation is built on.
Yes.
And yet it persists and it survives well into 21st century. I mean, it'll be what? How many years? He died in 1974. So
74, nearly 40 years.
Yeah, well, it's coming up to 50.
No, sorry, 50. Sorry, 50
yeah,
years.
coming
yeah,
up to 50 years. And he's still,
that's
you know, you hear his music on, somebody emailed me, sorry, you'll like this, a Nick Drake song was heard on EastEnders the other night.
Was it?
Popular British soap opera, you know, he does it everywhere.
Which one was on? I don't know, right. I should find that out. I just want to say a couple of things about that. The Keith Morris photo shoot, I believe he did do all three, because the first one obviously includes The Running Man. The second one, I think, was the one on the West Way, Brighter Later. And then obviously the third one was on Hampstead Heath. And it's interesting that actually those three photo shoots, they do reflect Nick, because the first one, apparently, you know, they were bouncing ideas. Brighter Later one, he's sort of still friendly, but you can feel kind of distance. And then obviously that Pink Moon one, I think, was just, Keith Morris described it as almost doing a still life. I mean, that might be a bit of exaggeration.
Yes.
But
yes, I think that's true.
Let's talk about the music. I feel like we haven't talked about the music enough. So these three albums, I was actually on a podcast late last year talking about Five Leaves Left. And I think the host asked me, what's your favourite of the three albums? And I know it's a cliche, but they almost are like three children, because they've all got three such distinct charms about them. So do you have a favourite of the three?
Not really. I mean, to be honest, I think of them all as one work in the sense. As I say, the actual number of tracks, I mean, I do tend to disregard the instrumental tracks on Brighter Later. I mean, I have songs that are personal favourites. I love Fly and, 3 Hours, because I sat and had a beer with Jeremy. And, you know, they're personal favourites. But, I mean, I think Five Leaves Left is very representative of its time. You know, it's late 60s singer-songwriter. And there were so many of them at the time. And this is one of the things that my book pointed out. I mean, I remember I interviewed Pete Frame from Zigzag magazine. And Zigzag was a monthly magazine. It was, I suppose, the English equivalent to Rolling Stone. It was the one that took the music of the counterculture seriously. And I said, what were your, memories or impressions of Nick, when he was alive? And he said, well, I mean, there was so many records out, in the same way that, Graham Parsons was of interest in that is in the Byrds and died early, and Nick was on Island Records and produced by Joe Boyd, which is of interest. But I think I found the Melody Maker the week that Pink Moon came out. I think that same week there were albums by Paul Simon, Al Stewart, James Taylor, Joni Mitchell, all these singer-songwriters, which was a big, big thing in the early 70s.
Yeah.
And Nick was sort of, lumped in with them. So again, in his lifetime, it's one reason why he was so sort of unrecognised. In terms of favourites, I think there is something quite unique about him. And there's that very English voice and his phrasing and that guitar playing. He had apparently very, very long fingers. So he effectively, when he was playing, it was like two people playing the guitar.
Oh, I see.
So you've got the guitar, you've got that voice. You have to pay credit to Joe Boyd and John Wood, the engineer. They capture one man, and it is like he's sitting next to you when you hear those records. There's an intimacy and an authority to that music. And he's the one who survives, I mean, these contemporaries are long, Steve Tilston and, Ralph McTell. If you think of Ralph McTell, it's probably Streets of London. It's Nick who's the one that people keep going back to.
Yeah, I mean, I should say that at the end of last year, I did a video with a friend of mine from Madrid. I used to be in a band in Madrid, and he is a master guitarist, and he kindly did a video where he was demonstrating the tunings and the styles. He wanted to learn a song to play live, and I think he learned Cello Song, which is one of the very best guitar ones. And he said the guitar took forever, but then he said, God, to sing along with it, because the vocal doesn't really match the guitar. Like, I can't really explain it, but meter-wise,
I mean,
it doesn't...
I spent hours trying to... People are obsessed with the guitar tunings,
yeah,
and I don't play, and it got to the point I thought, well, I mean, that's of interest to guitarists. He did something unique. I'm putting it down to his long fingers, let's leave it at that,
But there is something, I mean, he does fit, on one level he fits that mould of, John Martin, Bert Jansch, John Renbourn. But I still think, it's difficult for me because basically my entry point was Family Tree originally, which I didn't actually get madly into. Then it was that Skin Too Few, that great documentary. And when you hear, I think it's From the Morning, which is the last track on Pink Moon, they play it over this, as you said, this sort of very pastoral thing, and it suddenly takes on a different quality. And then they play Northern Sky, which I think is lovely, over the footage of them in Burma, and you've got Nick playing in the sea and everything, and that's always going to tug at the heartstrings.
That's the only moving footage, isn't it? Him as a little blonde-haired baby.
Yeah. So it's hard. Maybe it's hard for me to divorce the story from the music, but let me ask you one thing. Do you find Pink Moon depressing to listen to if you divorce it from the story, if that's possible?
I think it's very difficult to divorce it. I mean, I interviewed the press officer, David Sanderson, who unfortunately is no longer with us,
right.
Nick's press officer, and he said, yeah, I mean, he shuffled in this rather scruffy-looking figure. He left the tapes of the album on the desk of the receptionist and vanished, and that was it. And that was Pink Moon. And then he went into this steep, decline. That was in, 1972, and he died in 1974.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody really saw him after that.
Yeah.
So I think it's very difficult to dissociate Pink Moon from the end. And I think particularly when the Fruit Tree box set came out that included that Black Eyed Dogs, which we believe was, up until Toe the Line, we believe was the last song Nick ever recorded. And there's that haunting Robert Johnson, Hellhound on My Trail aspect to it. It's pretty doom and gloom. I don't see a lot of light coming into Pink Moon.
Except maybe From the Morning, and it was interesting that was the last song. Because that seems like Now We Rise and We Are Everywhere, because that's written on his tombstone.
Yes, very good point. If you go to Tamworth, underneath the tree, you'll find Nick Drake's grave, and that's what they've got engraved on his headstone. So yes, or is it Now We Rise and We Are Everywhere?
Now We Rise and We Are Everywhere, yeah.
So yes, they obviously felt there was something positive to be salvaged from it.
Because what's astonishing is those 4 songs. I mean, I think Joe Boyd apparently came back and was present when he recorded those 4. And the story goes that he was too traumatized to do the guitar and the vocals. And obviously when you hear Black Eyed Dog, it's such an outlier. But then you hear, that one, Rider on the Wheel?
Yes.
He sounds so calm. He has this wonderful, calm voice. It's quite astonishing if you think about, obviously it's hard to imagine what it must have been like to be there with him, but he's clearly in distress.
Yes, it's funny that Joe was with Warner Brothers, and he turned up recently. There's a wonderful documentary about Aretha Franklin recording her gospel album, and Joe Boyd's there because he was at Warner Brothers at the time in
that's
LA,
right.
and you see Joe with his shoulder-length hair looking very groovy, as indeed he still does.
Right.
Sure, there's a portrait of him in an attic somewhere that's horribly scarred. He looks remarkably good for his age. Joe, of course, went to America. And I think Joe was one of the few people who Nick could respond to when he went into that dark period of his life, to sit on the other side of the glass and hear those songs coming out. And they obviously came from a very dark place, a very deep well inside Nick.
Yes.
It should be said that whatever it was that dogged him at the time of his life was largely unrecognised. People wouldn't have known that he was depressed or he was a bit cast. He doesn't say much, in a very sort of quite light-hearted way. There was obviously some sort of illness, and when that came into his life, why that came into his life, I mean, if he'd had more recognition, it might have prolonged his life a bit. I mean, it's all speculation, isn't it?
Yeah, it's hard to know, isn't it? It's interesting because I've actually, in my own life, I've had episodes similar to that where it's a sort of mixture of anxiety and depression, and I can't quite face people. So I actually feel like I have a small inkling into what he might have been feeling, but the difference is that he seemed to be feeling it permanently for, let's say, the last year, or I don't know how long.
Yes.
It is interesting though, isn't it? Because he actually died nearly 3 years after Pink Moon came out. I think we always imagined that it was soon after, don't we? But it was actually, I mean, obviously it happened fairly quickly, but it seemed to be quite drawn out. I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things in Gabrielle's book, the book that came out, Remembered for a While.
Oh, that's it. Remembered for a While.
Is the big book. Now, because obviously it was Gabrielle, she got her father's letters and diaries. And to be honest, when I read it, one of the most depressing things was just how patient Rodney was with Nick. And, he'd ring and say, I've run out of petrol, and can we get me? And he'd, well, they fill the fucking car up with petrol. And he was so patient. That was the saddest thing. I mean, there's obviously they had their only son, was obviously talented, but he couldn't get it out somehow. And it must have been very difficult for them. And I think, Molly said she read the was it the last book Nick was reading, Myth of Sisyphus, the Camus book about
that's right,
putting
yeah.
the stone up the hill and it falls down, to try and gain some insight into her son's early death. And it must have been heartbreaking for them, you know.
Yeah.
But then going back to what we were saying earlier, you know, they were so touched when people came to their door and said, oh, you know, we've come from, you know, Albuquerque or Bremen or whatever, you know, we love Nick's music, you know, and just to have a look around and, you know, his room and everything. And they were so touched by that degree of interest in his work.
Yeah. In your book, did you speculate about his death, or would you rather not do that?
My impression, and this is without access to the medical records, because only the family would have that, and I believe, and I'm sure Richard Morton Jack, who's doing the authorised Nick Drake biography,
Yes.
will have had access to those and may well present a different opinion. My impression was that Nick was on these very, very heavy antidepressants called triptazole. I interviewed Nick Kent, who was the NME journalist who wrote very poignantly about Nick very soon after he died.
Yep.
And was famously no stranger to drug use. He knew whereof he spoke. And I remember talking to Nick Kent down, he was living in Paris, talking down the line, and he said, well, they gave me triptazole to get me off heroin. It's the worst fucking drug I've ever taken.
Oh, right.
And so if Nick was on those, my impression was he was on these antidepressants. He woke up and he couldn't remember how many he'd taken, and he took some more, then he woke up again and was very befuddled. My impression is, and I'm prepared to be corrected, that it was an accident. It was an accidental overdose of a prescribed antidepressant. That's my impression.
No, fair enough. Well, I think he was on a mixture of 3. Is that right? I can't remember.
Possibly, I can't understand.
Right.
So as I say, a family doctor in Middle England in the mid-1970s presented with a patient who suffered from depression. They would just chucked whatever was around at them. You know?
Yeah.
So it could have been a factor.
Because I think depression was always known as melancholia, wasn't it? And I think it was almost felt a bit of a teenage condition, just from what I've read. You know, it's something, don't worry, you'll grow out of it.
Poet's condition, yes, you know.
Yeah, you'll grow out of it, don't worry, that kind of thing.
I think Richard's book really will, he's got to people, because it's authorised, he's got the cooperation of the estate and Gabrielle, and also, you know, not undermining his research abilities. You know, he can Google stuff. When I was doing my book back in the mid-90s, the internet was it was science fiction, you know.
Yes.
It hadn't really probably been invented. And it was tracking people. But I'm very pleased with it. I think, you know, I got to people who spoke very eloquently and very poignantly about Nick. And I mean, the one thing that always annoyed me in the intervening years, whenever anything was written about Nick, whoever the writer was would say, well, of course, we now know that so-and-so and so-and-so. And I said, well, the only reason you know that is that I tracked the person down who was at that gig, who was at that session. And, you know, I never acknowledged. That upset me. But it just in closing, I think what put it in context was I interviewed Dave Pegg, who was the Fairport Convention bass, well, still is the Fairport Convention, but he played on Brighter Later.
Yeah. And
we met at the Half Moon in Putney, which is the great folky sort of pub in London. And I said, now, you know, Nick Drake, oh, yeah, Brighter, oh, yeah, I remember, yeah. I said, well, what are your memories of Brighter Later, Nick's second album? You know, he played bass on it. And we had a chat, and he came out with this great quote. He said, honestly, he said, if I was known as such a classic album, I'd have paid more attention at the time. And I think that, you know, that was Nick's reputation then, you know. He wasn't this cult figure. He was a promising singer-songwriter. I think had he lived, he'd be so happy with the interest and the attention paid to his music.
Oh, can you imagine, in a parallel universe, if he could come back somehow? How shocked he would be. Get him onto a computer and get him to Google his own name, and he'll go, what?
Yeah, I mean, the last time I looked, there were 24 million, you know.
Something like that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a nice Richard Thompson quote, because Richard played on, was a couple of songs with Nick.
Time has told me he played guitar.
Yeah. And when he got his medal from Her Majesty the Queen, he posted on his Facebook page, something, what was it like? And he said, well, at least she didn't ask me what it was like working with Nick Drake.
Oh, the Queen.
It's nice. He's become this sort of totem. And I just think it's so I never lived to see it. You know, he was, you know, very, very talented. He was... by all accounts, good company, nice bloke, and it just all went horribly wrong. And whether it was suicide, whether it was accident, he was taken far too soon. On a positive note,
Yes.
3 albums, and they are still quite inimitable. You go and seek them out, and to this day, there is nobody who sounds like Nick Drake, and that's quite a testament.
Yeah, I think that guitar, that almost posh-sounding voice, in fact, it's almost like well-spoken singing voice.
Yes.
And I agree with you about the lyrics. I think they don't all stand up, but on this podcast I was on, we sort of said that Five Leaves Left, some of the lyrics are good, but I think I don't agree that they were predicting the future, because I think he was living out they were sort of doomed poet lyrics almost. And I think when he gets the Pink Moon, I think he really is writing about himself. It is the voice of experience,
I think Five Leaves Left, the future's lies ahead and open. I think there's tremendous potential. He's got an album under his belt. He's on one of the most prestigious labels, certainly in the UK. He's got tremendous support from his producer, from his management company. I think the future lay bright ahead. I don't see all those indications of doom and gloom on Five Leaves Left. Even on Brighter Later, I think there's still hope. I think when the record sales didn't match his enthusiasm, that's when the war went a bit wrong. But who's to say? I mean, the interesting thing about Nick is that his career only began after he died.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, but just before we finish, actually, you mentioned there's a Facebook group called Nick Drake, an authorised biography. And the guy who runs it is Richard Morton Jack. And he seems a very, very dedicated guy. He posts nearly every day, and you post on there as well, which is great. So we've got that to look forward to. And please tell us about the project you're working on, because it's dear to my heart. So
Well, yes, it's very difficult getting a book published in the 21st century. I've never had an agent, and I just now publishers will only accept submissions through agents, so I've got to try and find an agent before I can do a submission. Funny enough, just as an afterthought on Nick, Bloomsbury published the Nick Drake book in 1997, and one of their other books that came out that year was the first in a long sequence of novels by a female writer called J.K. Rowling.
Oh,
and
I think I've
she
heard of her.
received the same advance as I did for the first Harry Potter book. Her advance was £2,500, as was my advance for Nick Drake. And I was in touch with her agent recently. He said, I'm very happy to supply an autographed first edition of my Nick Drake book for an autographed first edition of Harry Potter. But I haven't heard back from it yet.
Fair enough.
No, it's getting harder and harder. And I did a book about the Rolling Stones that came out in 2019, and it focused very much on their activities in 1969, which is incredible, even by their standards, an incredibly busy year. And I thought the only place to go after that is the Beatles. And over the years, I spent many, many hours with Paul McCartney and interviewed George and Ringo once. So I've got interviews. I missed John by a couple of months when I was at Melody Maker. He was due back in the UK in early 1981 for a private trip. My editor at Melody Maker, Ray Coleman, knew John very well, and he promised he'd get me to see John, but obviously that never happened. But I interviewed Paul many times and George and Ringo. So I thought, well, there's material there for a Beatles book, and there's surprisingly few Beatle biographies on the market. There are books about, somebody was delighted to say he's now got to the point where he's got 400 pictures for a book about the Beatles drinking tea. There are books about their philosophies, their musical equipment, their chauffeurs written the book, their hairdressers written the book.
Yes.
And there are surprisingly few biographies that take it from, I date it from Ringo's birth in 1940 as the oldest Beatle, up until 1970 when they broke up. The first part of my book is 1940 to 1963, which examines the Englishness. And the second part, obviously, is the conquering of America, Britain. The third part goes from 1970 to tomorrow, because there is this extraordinary interest in the Beatle brand. And as we were saying earlier, we've had 8 hours on Peter Jackson's film. We had the Let It Be box set. We had Paul McCartney's lyrics. It is the gift that keeps on giving. And then, of course, you've got, it'll be 60 years in this October since Love Me Do. Then it's 60 years next year since Beatlemania. It just goes on and on and on.
Absolutely.
And it is a compelling story. You think you know it all, but to go from Love Me Do to Strawberry Fields Forever in 4 years.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I mean, you're never going to get that again.
Absolutely, yeah.
So
and you told me earlier you hadn't seen Get Back, so you've got an absolute treat.
I've got a treat coming, yes. I devote the whole day to that, yes.
Yeah. But with all these things, it's just, I mean, I just read recently, You Never Give Me Your Money. It's a book about the Beatles, and
Oh yeah, it's great. Yeah.
talks about all the messiness that happened. But the thing that came out of it was, all you have to do is stick the records on, and everything else goes out the window, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's same with Nick Drake. Just put Five
Yeah.
Leaves Left. Put any of the albums on and just revel in it because it's fantastic.
Yes, but then of course you're not the person making those albums. I mean, you're if I had written Mr. Tambourine Man or Chimes of Freedom, I'd say, right, that's it, fine, I'm done.
Yeah.
Bob did that when he was 23. I mean, there are some people that touched by the hand of God. I think Bob was. Nick, I think the finger was hovering. I think he needed to live a bit longer. The Beatles, there's that extraordinary. Again, you go from that arc, Love Me Do to Pepper, and then after that, there's the White Album. Then there's Abbey Road, which, the second side of Abbey Road, the suite. I mean, it's just as good as it gets,
I think that's the most gorgeous Beatles music. Even if Abbey Road isn't everyone's favourite album, which it is a lot of people.
Agree, yeah. I mean, George Martin does these little bits in the middle, and there's all these. No, it's just it's sublime.
Yeah, it is.
They knew what they were doing. But then, of course, on the other hand, then they have to go to these business meetings, and then Yoko would be saying to John, oh, you're an artist, you shouldn't be wasting your time with this pop group. And then the manager, the men in suits would be saying, oh, your percentage, the pressure's on. And I think the thing is, you have to consider just how young they were. George was 26 when he left the Beatles.
Yes, that's
now,
right.
I don't know what you were like at 26, but I was struggling to, And he was, when you think what they'd done, they've been to the mountaintop.
Yeah.
And, it's an eternal credit. They carry on, You see McCartney, you see the Stones. I mean, it's what they do, and they're great. They're great at what they do. They're fantastic at what they do. To be in the same room as Paul McCartney or the Rolling Stones, hearing them do, Paul does a bit of the medley from Abbey Road, Mick does You Can't Always Get What You Want. It's fantastic. The old hairs on the back of the neck of Doing a Tango.
Yeah, I mean, I was born in 75, but I discovered the 60s about the late 80s with the Beatles, but all the other ones, and it's just been far and away my favourite music. I'd even put Paul Simon in that bracket. I mean, the amount of classics he'd written by the time of Bridge Over Troubled Water, and he must have been whatever he was, 26, 27.
I mean. Yeah. I mean, Bridge Over Troubled Water. I mean, I ain't a problem with that and Yesterday and these White Shade of Pale. You're so used to bad cover versions, and you're so used to hearing it in elevators. When you hear the original versions, they're so fantastic.
Yeah.
And to think they did that when they were in their 20s,
Yeah.
I mean, people are always banging on about the 60s, but I mean, I'm old enough to remember it. And it was great because you never knew. You turned the radio on and, you'd be getting 2 singles a year from the Beatles that weren't on albums. You'd be getting the Stones, the Who, the Animals, Van Morrison. It's one after the other. And a lot of it really stands up incredibly well today. Some of it, not so good when the old drugs kicked in and let's do one song over the entire side of an album, That's when it all got a bit tricky. But, no, it was great. And I mean, Nick was very much part of that. He was a huge Dylan fan. Jackson C. Frank, Burt Jansch, John Renbourn, all those people, those troubadours in the 60s, he admired. And, had he lived, I think he would have been I'm not sure a major talent, but I think he would have been a very, very good minor talent if he'd lived. Yeah. And it's just us we never got to know. So.
Absolutely.
There we are.
All right, listen, thank you very much. And when your Beatles book is done, I will get you on my other podcast, for sure.
We'll try and get when Richard's book's out in September or whatever. He's on Facebook, track him down, and I'm sure he'd be delighted.
I think I've already asked him. I got
it all wrong, and he got it all right. And I think he has got some interesting new stuff. But nearer the time, when the book's in the shop, he'll be very happy to talk about it.
Fantastic.
But it's lovely to talk to you, and thanks very much for your patience. And sorry, where are you based? Where actually are you?
Tunbridge, Kent.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Can you just stay on the line and we'll just do the official goodbye and then have a chat. So thanks very much and good luck.
It was one of those afternoons in the south of France after lunch, everybody very relaxed, and I played my guitar, and Nick Drake very quietly in the corner listened and applauded, and then somebody asked him to play, and that was an extremely moving experience. And he played some Billie Holiday and some blues. I'd never met anybody of my age who could do anything that well. Just magically get these sounds that are, so strong, flying across the